Schiff is the top Democrat on House Intelligence and joins me now. Welcome. Thank you. Great to see you.
Good to see you, too.
Congressman, the president, in a series of events now, continuously exempts Russia from any kind of blame, opposing the sanctions bill with Bob Corker, giving a speech on Afghanistan and mentioning Pakistan, mentioning India rather, joining in, but not mentioning the fact that Russia is rearming the Taliban in Afghanistan. I mean, where does this go?
It's really hard to say, but clearly the president's views on Russia are different than most Americans and indeed different than both parties in Congress. That's why that sanctions bill passed with such overwhelming support, and I would agree with the comments you just played from my colleague Senator Blumenthal. I think the legislation to protect Bob Mueller has equal bipartisan support, and it's important that that be out there now, that bipartisan support be apparent to the president. We're much better avoiding some kind of a constitutional crisis that would take place if he were to fire Mueller than we are waiting till after the fact to try to legislate about it. So I think those steps are very important. Again, we continue to be perplexed by why this president would treat Russia so differently. And, of course, our investigation is trying to determine whether there are reasons for that the public is not aware. And that investigation is very much ongoing.
And he was tweeting against James Clapper, who took him on after the speech the other night. James Clapper tweeted, "The president who famously got caught lying to Congress is now an authority on Donald Trump. Will he show you his beautiful letter to me?" This after, let's just play a little bit of what Clapper had to say the other night after the president's Phoenix speech.
I worry about, frankly, the access to nuclear codes. If he, in a fit of pique, he decides to do something about Kim Jong-un, there's actually very little to stop him. The whole system's built to ensure a rapid response if necessary. So there's very little in the way of controls over exercising a nuclear option, which is pretty damn scary.
I mean, your reaction to this brewing controversy, the former director of national intelligence who briefed the president for a number of months when he was a candidate, when he was president-elect, and of course now the president and the way he behaved the other night.
Well, those of us that have known Director Clapper for a long time, and I know you have as well, Andrea, know this is not someone who's prone to hyperbole. This is someone who has served the country for over half a century, who is really quite plain-spoken, but does not tend to exaggerate. So when he says things like this, I always say, gets people's attention. It got the president's attention. The president tweeting that, is he some kind of an expert on Donald Trump? Well, he is actually an expert on dangers to the country, and he recognizes the dangerous bluster that we have from this president and the fact there are very few controls over the president's ability to deploy military force, including nuclear force. So I think the concerns that Director Clapper has raised are remarkably and regrettably very much on point. It's certainly something we're discussing in Congress. There's not an easy remedy to it in terms of the president's ability to act impetuously or without adequate consultation either with the Congress or his own team. So it does concern us, and I'm glad that Director Clapper is speaking out.
The defense secretary under the system can weigh in to agree with a nuclear strike option, but can't veto it. That is solely the province of the commander-in-chief, as I understand it.
Well, I think that's right. And, we have legislation in Congress. I think Representative Liu has introduced to try to put a congressional curb on what the president can do in this area. But that's very hard to accomplish because Article 2 does give the president the power to defend the country if it's under threat of imminent attack. So I think there are certain limits that Congress can place, and we ought to try to place them. For one thing, we helped ourselves by the fact that we haven't taken up an authorization to use force, for over a decade and a half, when these old authorities are clearly out of date and inapplicable to how we're using force today. So Congress has been its own worst enemy. That was a problem during the Obama administration, but it's an even bigger problem now that we have a chief executive that so many people are asking questions about.
I want to ask you about the so-called dossier. Glenn Simpson, the former Wall Street Journal investigative reporter who's now the head of Fusion GPS, testified for 10 hours before the Judiciary Committee behind closed doors on Tuesday. And it was his firm who hired the very well-regarded British intelligence officer, Christopher Steele, to do that dossier. Now, Senator Grassley has told a town meeting in Iowa that he's looking into holding a public hearing, but doesn't have an inherent objection to releasing the transcript of that. Simpson and his attorney say that it's up to the committee to release the transcript. Where do we stand on the investigation into finding out whether the really troubling contents of that so-called dossier may be true?
Well, you know, there's been, I think, an effort by some to discredit the firm Fusion GPS or discredit Mr. Steele. And as you say, Mr. Steele has a very good reputation, is reportedly a former British intelligence officer. I can't confirm that, but is reported to be very well regarded. And I think the key thing from an investigative point of view is not trying to impeach the people who produced the report or commissioned the report, but rather find out whether the facts are true in the report. And when you look at just what has become public, some of the public information is very much in line with what is reported in that dossier. And I'll give you one example that really strikes me. And the dossier talks about sources within the Kremlin reporting that they have 3 goals. They want to find out what support friendly U.S. persons would want. They want to gather relevant intelligence, and then they want to disseminate compromising information. Well, all of that is implicated in the Don Jr. emails that have already been released. An effort by the Russians through their proxies to find out what the Trump campaign would want, and what they want was negative information about Hillary Clinton. They certainly gathered that intelligence by hacking into Democratic institutions, and they certainly disseminated that intelligence. So the 3 core goals that are outlined in that dossier by that particular source do seem to be very well borne out. I think people put too much focus on the salacious allegations within the dossier about that video, as if that's really what the dossier is about. That's the least significant part of the dossier from my point of view. So we ought to do everything we can to figure out what of the serious allegations are true or untrue, and spend a lot less time, I think, just trying to attack the messenger.
Adam Schiff, thank you very much.